Hello, and welcome to this discussion about the net zero carbon transition by 2050 and some of the key questions and challenges for buildings. I'm Richard Twinn, Senior Manager at the UK Green Building Council, and I'm delighted to be joined by Joe Holden, Sustainability Director at Peel Land and Property, and Steve Finnegan, Director of the Zero Carbon Research Institute and lecturer at the University of Liverpool. Now, at UKGBC, we've been working on the net zero carbon transition for the past few years now, and central to this has been producing our framework definition for net zero carbon buildings. The framework is specifically about trying to build consensus and foster collaboration by outlining how net zero relates to buildings for both construction and for operation. Now, it sets out principles for the approaches needed to achieve this, and also how those sorts of claims should be evidenced. It's an evolving framework, of course, though, because we don't actually have all the answers today. We don't know exactly what a net zero carbon building will look like in 2050. But given the urgency of addressing the climate crisis at the moment, we still need to be doing all that we possibly can today, and then fill in some of those unknowns as we go. So that's what we're going to be talking about today, some of those first steps that we need to take and some of those future unknowns. Before we do that, though, I will hand over to Joe and then Steve to talk through some of the things that they have been doing around net zero carbon buildings. Joe.
Thanks, Richard. Hi. Yes, so I'm the Sustainability Director for Peel L&P. We're a landowner, property owner and a regeneration specialist. And we now have actually 17 buildings verified as operational net zero carbon against the UKGBC definition, which includes 6 buildings we just verified at Media City UK. And we've also recently set our science-based target to reduce our emissions intensity by 68% by 2030. That's great progress for us as a business. I think the discussion today is really about all the fantastic guidance that comes out from UKGBC, including the recent Building the Case for Net Zero document. It's all fantastic stuff. And it's really about how we translate that into practice, and working with organisations such as University of Liverpool to really convert it into practical things that we can do on the ground to improve our buildings and work towards the net zero carbon target. So I'll pass over to Steve.
Okay, thanks, Joe, and thanks, Richard. So it's a pleasure to be here today. And just to recap, I'm actually the director of the Zero Carbon Research Institute at the university. So this has been in development for the past 5 years now, and we're working with a huge number of clients looking at 3 particular elements. That is net zero carbon design and strategy. So trying to communicate the UKGBC guidance on a practical level. Also looking at the operational carbon of modern methods of construction and buildings and what that means. And then equally of importance is looking at the embodied CO2 and the embodied carbon as well. So every piece of work that we do is linked to the UKGBC and their sort of strategies and their guides, which again, I echo Joe's thoughts, is fantastic. And we're also working alongside Joe looking at this embodied carbon issue. And a summary of our work can be seen on our website, which is zcri.co.uk. Thank you.
So we'll start with just some of the basics around achieving net zero carbon. The framework pushes energy efficiency quite heavily as a key step to achieving net zero. But from your perspective, for buildings in operation, is it right to always focus on energy efficiency first to achieve net zero? Joe, do you want to take that one first?
Yeah, I think it's really important to focus on energy efficiency and follow the sort of the mitigation hierarchy in terms of your journey towards net zero carbon. So yes, definitely, you know, you can really easily start taking action now by measuring your kilowatt hours, understanding your baseline, setting a science-based target. All of these things are the things that you should start with. And when we look at it in our portfolio, you know, a lot of our energy is tied up in our existing portfolio, and it's where we can affect the changes in the retrofits for those buildings to really make a difference. So an example of that is a building called the Vic at Media City, where it's a very it's a 30-year-old building that we've invested in to make energy savings. So by investing heavily in energy efficiency technology at that building, we're now making, you know, significant annual savings on our energy bills, but also 60% reduction in our energy and carbon annually. And then we can use that knowledge to apply to our future retrofits as well. So definitely the place to start, but there's no reason why we can't also look at renewables at the same time as energy efficiency. And also an important message in this is really lobbying government to double the current forecast of renewable electricity supplies. It really needs to be 4 times the current level, and is the most efficient way of helping all of the built environment to become net zero carbon at a quicker pace.
Thanks, Joe. And yes, you picked up on an important point there of sort of the differences between new and existing buildings and the sorts of challenges that you have to face in terms of driving energy efficiency, and then it might be a slightly different approach for different types of buildings. So, Stephen, where does energy efficiency sit from your perspective?
Okay, so in order to achieve net zero carbon, operational net zero carbon, it's quite neatly defined in 3 key documents, one of which is obviously the UKGBC framework definition. There's also the LETI guidance, and there's also the RACS professional statement. And all of these documents point to a key area really, is that if we can balance operational efficiency with on-site and off-site renewables, we can achieve net zero carbon. So it's absolutely important that we focus on that energy efficiency, simply because if we do so, then there's less reliance, less demand for energy, and therefore less demand for costly on-site, off-site renewables and offsetting too. So it's absolutely imperative that we get that energy efficiency right as the very first stage to design and develop net zero carbon buildings.
Great, thank you. And that also picks up on an important point about the transition more widely as well, that in terms of the UK transitioning, we need to be increasing our renewable energy capacity, but it's much more cost effective to be bringing down our energy demand to meet that renewable energy capacity, rather than simply waiting for the energy system to solve it all on its own. It can be much more cost effective, and it can also mean we can achieve net zero much quicker if we've got both of those levers being pulled at the same time. So one of the key issues as well that we're going to need to address as part of the net zero and transition is literally how we are powering net zero carbon buildings. Given the decarbonisation of the grid, there have been lots of discussions about heat in particular, and whether we should just be moving all of our buildings to be powered by electricity. So my question is, should we be transitioning all buildings to be powered by 100% electricity by 2050? Steve, do you want to tackle that one?
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Richard. I think we need to take a step back on this really, and we need to look at, in order to achieve net zero carbon status, we have to use sources of power which are the least damaging to the environment. If we look back 10, 20 years and look at the UK energy generation mix, we were quite carbon intensive. As we aim towards 2050, the grid is becoming decarbonised due to the wholesale and wide-scale adaptation of solar and wind and so on. So at the moment, it is 100% right to be using electricity as our main source of power because it's the least carbon intensive source of supply. However, that is more expensive than gas, and gas is still used primarily for heating. So the Committee on Climate Change report in May 2019 did recommend 4 key recommendations for 2050. And for the building side of things, they mention energy efficiency and low carbon heating, i.e. the use of heat pumps and so on. So it's also a view by the Committee of Climate Change that we'll move possibly towards a hydrogen economy to replace gas grids by 2030. So in answer to your question, Richard, I think, yes, we are right to use electricity for now, but we have to see what happens over the transition for the next 10 years and see if the hydrogen economy kicks in too.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. So it's partly a question of uncertainty of what kind of options we are going to have available over the next 30 years as alternatives to electricity.
Yeah.
Joe, what's your perspective as someone who's going to have to try and do this and transition buildings, maybe moving to electric or potentially hydrogen?
Well, we certainly need to think about our overall energy consumption and getting that down first, and looking at fabric first and using less wherever we can. That's definitely a consideration. And also, absolutely looking towards electricity. But we need to really consider and understand the best energy sources for a particular type of situation. And where that is as well, because with the prices of electricity being much higher than gas, and this is an issue particularly in the northwest, we don't want to be pushing communities into a situation of fuel poverty by putting them onto 100% electricity at the moment because of the prices and the market. So we do have to really consider that very carefully for communities. And something like a district heat network can work really well, and where we can keep prices down, we can provide homes with affordable heat and very efficient heat. It's more than 3 times more efficient use of energy to use a district heat network than it is plugging into electricity from the grid. So I think very much needs to consider the local situation and also the consequences for the homeowners in terms of the price they're going to pay for their energy.
Yeah, and I think this sort of demonstrates there are just so many unknowns about the technology, but also there will be so many nuances in terms of the types of buildings and the situation. And when exactly they should be transitioned. So there probably isn't really any kind of strict technological solution that we really should be prescribing for heating at the moment. But at the same time, you've both flagged up that energy efficiency is almost a no regrets option for now until we have better clarity about how we're transitioning our existing stock in particular.
And in the northwest, we are working with other partners. In the northwest, we are working with other partners to progress hydrogen, and through using hydrogen, then we can use the sort of existing infrastructure to blend hydrogen into existing gas supplies. So that is a great amount of potential to decarbonise supplies for homeowners very quickly.
I'd also like to add that if we are moving to this transition of powering all buildings by 100% electricity, we need to think about how and what technologies we are using, which leads us on to another point, which is the embodied energy and embodied carbon of, for example, air source, ground source heat pumps, solar PV, solar thermal systems. If we are going for this sort of industry 4.0 stance of moving towards high-end new technologies, then what about the carbon impact of creating and manufacturing and transporting those?
Yes. So as far as possible, we need to be trying to look at passive solutions and how we're reducing demand as far as possible. So we're minimising our reliance on the technology that is there, which should be helpful. Obviously, it's a key part of this discussion, but we shouldn't necessarily be waiting for technology to come along and solve this all for us.
Yeah.
So one of the particularly big issues which a lot of the sector hasn't really got its head around yet is embodied carbon and the impacts that go into the construction of buildings in particular. It's a debate that has been around for a long time, but there still seems to be a lot of inconsistency in the way that life cycle assessments, which assess embodied carbon, are undertaken. So my question is, why is it that we can't accurately calculate the carbon impact of construction yet? Steve, do you want to take that one first?
Yeah, thanks, Richard. As you mentioned, the main tool that the industry uses, well, industry and academia use to try to calculate the embodied carbon of materials is life cycle assessment. So life cycle assessment has been around for a long time. Even in 1960, for example, Coca-Cola used LCA to make a more efficient product. So LCA is the main tool, and there are lots of tools available, such as CIMA Pro, GABI, one-click LCA, and so on. And each of these tools is reliant on data. And that's the key point, really. We can't accurately calculate the carbon impact of construction because we don't have the accuracy of data. It's very accurate in certain areas and completely inaccurate in other areas. An example of that being concrete. There was a journal paper released recently which looked at 110 different types of concrete, the environmental impact. There's also something called an environmental product declaration, an EPD. So this is trying to make a European standard. The actual standard is EN 15804. And as part of that standard, we're trying to get some level of consistency. Using EN 15804 provides guidance on category rules. So if we are assessing, for example, the impact of concrete, there's a consistency in the approach. You know, what manufacturing, how is it transported, what happens when it's recycled, and the end of life. So as I mentioned, we've got a problem there, is that some products have EPDs, a lot of products don't. So we're forced as practitioners to chop and change between things like the Green Book Live, things like RICS guidance, the ICE database, the one-click LCA tool, and so on. There's so many different, the BRE Green Guide, for example, there's lots of different sources and data sources. So that's a problem within the industry, and one that we're encountering now on live projects that I'm working on at present.
Yeah, so there's potentially a lot of tools and a lot of different routes, but it's if anything the inconsistency and particularly in the data that's being used as part of them.
Exactly, Richard. So it's very difficult. Some cover, for example, stages A1 to A5, you know, looking at product and construction. Some go from A through to B to C, look at the whole life impact. So how can we compare like for like when we're only able to compare apples and pears? So it's very difficult to do, and it adds complexity. I think the UK, well, I know that the UKGBC network definition, which is made of a very, very good attempt at trying to define what's in and out of scope when we're looking at embodied carbon, is a very powerful start. But in my opinion, it needs to be expanded. There needs to be more components of the building, and really I think longer term, we need to look beyond net zero and look at what I call absolute zero carbon. And I think that's where we'll go, but it's very early stages.
Yeah, that is that's the ultimate objective, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
But there's sort of steps we will need to be taking to get towards that. So, Joe, as someone who is building buildings that are getting asked questions about embodied carbon, how have you found the process around life cycle assessment and embodied carbon assessment?
Well, from a very practical point of view, it's about taking a team approach to carbon. Really looking at the project team needs to understand it, and I think not just ourselves, but a lot of similar businesses will be in the same boat in terms of being on a journey to understand carbon, for the whole team to understand carbon, and that the fact that we don't just need a financial appraisal of a project, we need a carbon appraisal of the project as well. And when you're looking at a carbon appraisal, you think, well, where's my first stop in that? Maybe it should be my cost consultant, my QS. And just the fact that finding cost consultants who understand carbon, who are willing to talk in terms of carbon and not just the financials, is one of the first hurdles in itself, and is a real stepping stone to then using the tools that we've discussed to calculate the embedded carbon, and therefore the issues with those tools at the moment as well. So I think it's about the transition into embedding carbon as an issue for the whole project team, understanding it, and for our suppliers who we're working with to understand it. So our main contractor, our cost consultant, to understand that carbon, it needs to be assessed as fully as the financial aspect, and then looking at the main sources of carbon, not trying to think we want to get this perfect first time, but really you can quite easily, and from the retrospective analysis we've done, you can look at the main areas of carbon within a new building and to focus on those first and see how you can reduce that, and then learn from that process and apply it to your next building. So I think that it's about making sure that we can overcome hurdles to continue to take action, and not say, oh, sorry, it's too big, it's too hard at the moment, it's just too much. We try to keep chipping away at it so that each time we have a new development, we can improve upon it, knowing that it's not going to be a silver bullet, that we'll get there step by step.
I think as well, Joe, just to lead on from there, if we go back to the questions that we've been discussing today, let's imagine a position in the very near future where we have buildings which are extremely airtight, extremely energy efficient, very, very low energy requirement, 100% powered by electricity through on-site renewables and off-site renewables, the grid becoming decarbonised. Should we really be concerned about the operational carbon? Will that just organically reach zero as time goes on? And are we shifting all of that carbon onto being embodied carbon? So some of the analysis work that we've done, so a whole life carbon assessment I've recently completed for the Everyman Theatre, for example, puts the embodied carbon figure at around 80 to 90% of the whole life impact of the building. So I think the next big part of work on embodied carbon is looking into all of that really, and being clear and concise, and again asking the question, are we just shifting carbon from one form to another?
I think we also need to consider that by 2050, 80% of our building stock is already built. So we have a lot already there of an age that we can't do so much with. So it is taking the hierarchy of looking at the energy efficiency, looking at those longer term retrofits, to understand, okay, the payback for this work may be 10 years, but actually we're looking at a science-based target which has got a length of 10 years as well. So making the justification for those bigger refurbishment projects within our existing portfolio, and understanding that we don't want stranded assets. We're going to be hanging on to these buildings, or at least somebody's going to want an asset to invest in, which is fit for the future and is as low carbon as it possibly can be. So I think we're always going to have the two strands of looking at operational carbon, as well as the new buildings and the embodied carbon. And between the two, there's so much that we can be doing and learning from at the moment as we go through this transition into really understanding it, and knowing how we're going to go forward as the new technology comes forward as much as anything.
Yeah, and particularly with regard to the existing stock, it sort of starts to get you into discussions about circular economy in particular, and how we're maintaining the value of our existing assets. Often the largest single embodied carbon elements when you're constructing a building are from the structure itself. So should we actually be looking to try and maintain as many existing structures as we've got, and fundamentally rethink our development models, thinking about the provision of space rather than necessarily the provision of a new development? And it's all of these questions which will surely be interplaying in terms of embodied versus operational impacts, and how far you can take different types of buildings, which are really going to be quite challenging over the next 30 years or so.
It will also be really interesting, Richard, to look at, for example, the impact of COVID-19 and how that will have an impact on the design and the use of buildings within the future as well. So I think this is an ever-changing area of interest, and there's so much that we need to think about on a consistent basis.
Yes, thank you.